Hello everyone, my name is Claudia, and today I'm going to talk about how to migrate your Android projects to Gradle Kotlin DSL. A bit about me, I'm a senior Android engineer at Babylon, but I'm a contractor. Before to start talking about the interesting part, I would like to make a confession. I've never been a huge fan of Gradle. Actually, I know it's really flexible, and you can do many things with it. But I've never been that curious about learning Groovy to do very complex stuff with Gradle. And if I think about it, I would say that when it comes to Android, I was more interested in other things like UI rather than performance or plugins. And the problem is, I believe this is not only me. Many people have this feeling. And I think it would be better if everyone could feel more comfortable with Gradle. And also, because if you feel more comfortable, you can do many things, and you can be more productive. If you have a small team with a small project, here you don't find a problem, because even though you need to tweak the Gradle files, they are fairly small and you don't need to tweak much. So everything is tidy. But on the other hand, if you have a big project and a big team, be sure that the first thing you're going to take a look at is developer productivity and performance. The good news is Gradle can help you with this, can help your Android team work faster. But what if you need to hire an expert in Gradle and Groovy to help your team go faster? If it's only one person within a very big team, it can end up in a bottleneck. So, is there a solution for this problem? Is there a way so we can avoid hiring an expert and get our developers more engaged with the Gradle scripts? Yes. So I believe with Kotlin DSL, we can solve this problem. We can help our Android developers to get more involved with the Gradle scripts. But what is Gradle Kotlin DSL? So we have the solution. Let's talk about it. Kotlin DSL is a domain-specific language that Gradle created as an alternative of Groovy DSL. You can do the same as Groovy. You can set up your project, add your dependencies, create plugins and tasks. But why is it a better alternative to Groovy DSL? Well, because Groovy, because of the nature of the language, Groovy is usually resolving the elements you use in runtime, which means you can set up your Gradle script with elements that you are not able to confirm if they are available at completion time, because it's a dynamic resolution. However, with Kotlin DSL, they created the type access source model, which means that at compile time, you will be able to know what Gradle model have available for you. Thanks to this, you will have a better and enhanced experience with Android Studio, because it will be able to provide you highlighting in the syntax, code completion, navigation, and also declaration and documentation access. This is an example of a Gradle script using Groovy DSL. And in this case, we want to access the version code. We try to go to the declaration, but Android Studio tells us that is not possible. On the other hand, this is the same script migrated to Kotlin DSL. And as you can see, the highlighting is already more complete. And also, if we want to try and access the version code declaration of this, it will be able to show us the information provided and also navigate to the source. Also, when you're writing your configuration blocks, you always have information about what's the class inside this block. So you are aware of what you can do with it. This is very helpful because you don't get lost when you try to set up your configuration block. So let's talk about a few things that I found interesting when I was migrating scripts. I would like to share with you how to get started with it, what are the differences between Groovy syntax and Kotlin syntax. Also, what are the errors I made, so I can spare you some time and you can avoid them. As well, some cool stuff that Kotlin brings to the table that might be useful for Gradle, and some questions that I was wondering myself. The very first thing you need to do in order to allow Kotlin DSL to be detected in your project is to import your project into Android Studio, selecting the build Gradle file from the root folder. If you don't do this, Android Studio will not know that you're potentially are gonna use Kotlin DSL for your scripts, so it won't be able to assist you with code completion, navigation, etc. The second thing you need to do is migrating your scripts, renaming the scripts you want to migrate. In this case, what we need to do is to add at the end of the extension .kts. And then Android Studio will know that from now on, this script is going to have Kotlin DSL syntax. My recommendation would be to start with the setting.gradle, because usually it's the smallest script possible, and at least you have a smooth start. Don't worry about the other scripts, because it's possible to have Groovy scripts and Kotlin script in Gradle. They can live together in the same project, so you can do one script at a time. And if you change the extension and you're using Android Studio, what you will see? Well, this is an example, and all you can see since you have only changed the extension of the file is red highlighting. Because in this case, Android Studio is expecting you to have Kotlin DSL syntax, but we still have Groovy DSL. The good thing about Android Studio and Kotlin DSL is already it's prompted you what is expecting to receive. In this case, it mentions that include is missing some parentheses. So it gives you a hint about what you need to do in order to migrate stuff. So that's it. Once you change the extension of the file, you can start changing the content. But what about the syntax? What I need to change from Groovy to Kotlin? There are three main differences when you migrate your scripts, and they're very, very simple. The first one is strings. In Groovy DSL, or Groovy, we can use single quotes or double quotes in order to declare a string. However, in Kotlin DSL, we can use only double quotes. That's one thing we need to keep an eye on when we migrate. The second thing is equals operator. In Groovy, you can avoid using the equals operator when you're assigning a value to a property or a variable. But on Kotlin, we cannot. We need to use the equals. And the third one is the parentheses. When we call a function, in Groovy, we can avoid using parentheses, but in Kotlin, we cannot. This is something that was confusing to me at the beginning when I started with Gradle, because as you can see here, if you don't really know and it's your first time using Gradle, here you don't know if you are really assigning a variable or calling a function. So if you're playing with it and you don't have much experience, you usually will need to go to the plugins code source and then make sure that you understand what you're dealing with. On the other hand, with Kotlin DSL, on the right-hand side, we know that we are assigning a value and we are calling a function, which it might be more beneficial for people starting with Gradle. So those are the three things you need to keep an eye on. Strings, you need to use double quotes with Kotlin DSL. Equals operator, you need to use them when you assign values. And when calling a function, always using the parentheses. So now you are ready to start migrating your scripts. So let me share with you a few of the tips, errors, or things I find interesting in my journey. The very first step that Gradle recommends is, even before changing the extension of the file from Gradle to Gradle KTS, is to adapt the syntax of Ruby as close as possible to Kotlin. So we think about what I mentioned earlier. Even on Groovy, we would migrate our single quotes to double quotes, and would still be Groovy DSL. We will add parentheses to all the function calls, and we will use equals when assigning the values to our properties. So this way, it will help Android Studio to detect the synthesis more easily, because it's really similar to what Kotlin expects from Kotlin. This is something I didn't do. When I started migrating script, I started to change names like crazy, and I got a bit crazy. And if you do that, you end up having a bunch of lines all red, and it might be a bit painful. In my case, I started to change stuff, and the errors didn't go away. I noticed that in some cases, Android Studio won't get rid of the error until the whole file is correct, which means that if it's just the first time you're migrating a script and you don't have this help, you're going to be changing things on the dark, which is going to be very difficult. But what happens if you change the extension and you're at this step? Well, you have two options. You can go back and change the extension to .gradle and try to adapt the syntax from Groovy DSL to Kotlin DSL. Sorry, from Groovy to a closer version of Kotlin DSL. And the other option you have, if you want to change back if you don't want to change back the extension, is to comment all the lines of code. This is really ugly, but at some point it helped me. So you will comment everything, and then line by line, you migrate it. Android Studio will check it. It will say it's fine. Then you can proceed further. In my case, I would recommend adapting the syntax of Groovy to make it closer as Kotlin. Another thing which was very, very useful when I started migrating scripts is auto-reload dependencies. As soon as you start playing with Android Studio and Kotlin DSL, it will prompt you this message. Which means that if you enable this, you will be able to get early feedback as soon as you change your script. For example, in this case, I was trying to type the name of my module, one of the modules of my project, and the real name is search, but I mistype it for circ. Just straight away, after typing the C and waiting for like half a second, the Android Studio already showed me a message on top saying that it couldn't sync. This was very helpful, because if you don't enable auto-reload dependencies, then you need to wait until you sync manually to see these errors. And imagine you are changing the file, you're writing a few lines, and you might happen to mistype a few things. When you sync, the error is not going to be that helpful to tell you exactly what line of code is wrong. So in this case, as you type, you can see what's wrong. This is something confusing for me. Well, it was confusing for me at the beginning when I was reading the documentation, because there are many, many ways of adding plugins to Gradle. And we have mainly two ways. The old one, which is the one at the bottom, and the newest one, which is the plugins block. So the good thing about the plugins block is that Gradle already added extension functions and extension properties for you to add plugins easily. You don't need to worry about the version, you just need to type the name, and more of the core plugins are already added. So it's really easy. And if you don't know of if there isn't any plugin available in the Gradle core, if this plugin is added to the Gradle plugin portal, you can still add it with the plugin within the plugin block using the ID function. And this is the old way, and also the way that you need to use to add plugins if they are not included in the Gradle plugins portal. This is also useful if you have a plugin you created locally in your project and you want to add it directly, and you don't want to publish it anywhere. So you can use this function as well. Another useful command that I use a lot is the Gradle task. I've never used it before, unless I wanted to see what kind of task I wanted to run for testing or any other plugin. But in this case, when Android Studio doesn't really know what's the problem with Kotlin DSL, it didn't happen to me often. It was just few things that Android Studio got confused with, and it couldn't show me what's the error, or it couldn't highlight anything. Then Gradle task helped me to have a proper stack trace and understand what was the problem. This is very useful, and also if you keep changing a few things, running this periodically, it will help you to see if the build is still working. Another recommendation would be not to use canaries or beta versions, because if you're playing with this for the first time and you're experimenting, you don't want to put more experimentation in your way. At the beginning I started with the canary, but then after having a few random things and Android Studio getting stuck, I just switched back to Android Studio 3.5, which is the stable version, and since then I didn't have any problems with Kotlin DSL. Also, one thing that happened to me once, and it took me like 2 hours to realize, is that I was changing, as I said before, I was changing names like crazy. And instead of changing just the extension, I happened to misspell build with double L. At that point, when I was checking the script in Android Studio, everything was red, but everything was supposed to be fine. It was a really, really small script. But it wasn't compiling, it wasn't building, and Android Studio wasn't saying anything about the error. Also, I tried with Gradle task, and nothing useful came up from the stack trace. And after few hours checking what were my changes, then I realized that the build Gradle was incorrect. This happens because Gradle expects your build Gradle files to be called build and nothing else. If you want to change the name, you need to specify it. You need to specify in your script and tell Gradle that they have a different name. But if you don't, you need to stick to build. So what other things we can do with Kotlin that can help our life make our life easier in Gradle? So imagine you have a build file with tons of dependencies, like this one. And you spend like few hours organizing them in a groovy file, in an array, to group them together, tidy them, so they are more beautiful. But what if we could navigate to the dependencies, for example? With Groovy, we cannot. What if we could structure them in a different way that is more readable and reusable across the project? And what if we could see if the dependencies are used or not? Well, with Kotlin DSL, we can create a model and we can structure them the way we want. And we just need to create a file in the build source folder from the root project. And with Kotlin, we can see if these dependencies are used or not. We also can navigate to the usages, so we know exactly where they are. And also, we can give the structure as the structure we want, so we can reuse them in many, many modules. But even if we do this, we use an object called libraries, and we use it here. It doesn't really change the size of the dependencies block. It's still very, very long. What if we could reuse the size of this dependencies block to the minimum amount possible? Well, we know that when it comes to adding dependencies, we have a few configuration functions. We have implementation, we have capped, we have test implementation. We don't have that many. So we could create a class where we can define the different types of configuration functions. In this case, implementation, capped test implementation, and Android test implementation. And we could map them to any of our dependencies. So we know what dependency, what configuration needs to use. And also we could create a list of all these dependencies. And the result in our build Gradle file would be just 10 lines of code, which we could go through the array of libraries we created, and then for each one we can check the configuration and apply to it. And also, this brings many other benefits, like if we want to add more dependencies, we don't need to add them here. We just need to add them to the libraries class or object, unless we want to add a new configuration type, which needs to be added here. And this can be reused in many, many Gradle files. So as you can see, we started here with a bunch of dependencies, and we ended up here, which is really, really great. But what we need to do in order to create this object? Well, we need to create the build source folder in the root of the Android project. And we need to create a build Gradle KTS file. And we need to say that we want to use the Kotlin DSL plugin. By doing that, and Gradle Android Studio understand what we want to do, and then it's just a matter of creating our class inside the normal folder, source, main, Java, etc. And once we have this, we can use them in our build files. But what else can we do? Well, as you know, with Kotlin we can do many, many things, many cool things. And one of these is extension functions. I've seen this kind of function in many, many places, which was a normal function, checking if the build was created from Jenkins or local machine, and it was duplicated in many projects, in many modules or many build scripts. But we could create extension function, which is just using the project, and whenever you use the project, you can call this function. But also, this is a plugin created by one of the Babylon's colleagues, and it's really nice to see how you can add rules. This is Markdown linked, and you can add rules. The rules you want to define, you use the unary plus operator, which means you can create idiomatic plugins, very easy to use for everyone, and very easy to understand. Cool, so far you should be convinced, and same way I was convinced when I was reading documentation and playing a bit with it, but you might have also some questions. What are the trade-offs? Well, after playing for a bit with it, there are a few things that Android Studio doesn't really detect very well. For example, if you already migrated your scripts and you have everything migrated from Gradle to Gradle KTS, imagine you want to add a different module with Android Studio. Then it won't be able to add this new module to your settings.gradle.kts. It will create a separate setting.gradle. That's one thing, but it's not really a problem, which I wouldn't categorize as a blocker for using it. Another thing would be that for the first time you check out a project and you do a clean build, if your project is using Kotlin DSL, it will take 3 times longer to build. Also, if you change something from the build source file, build source folder, where we had our libraries class, it's supposed to be should be slower as well, but this is something I couldn't reproduce consistently. Sometimes it was slower, sometimes it was not. But after that, changing the content of the files periodically, or even within 2 hours, let's say, the first time was slower, but then for the next 2 hours, changes were very, very, very fast. And if I was comparing with Groovy and Kotlin DSL, and it was even the same amount of seconds. And you might be wondering, is it worth to migrate? Well, it depends on many, many things. But if you think about the time that you might spend trying to learn Groovy or trying to understand what the Groovy plugin your teammate created, then I would say it's very worthy if you already have Kotlin in your project and you really know very well Kotlin, because the learning curve is really small. You can understand better how things are done, and you have more capability. You're more capable of creating cool things, tweak the performance of your project, and also create plugins that help your life easier. But what about big projects? Well, when it comes to big projects, we have two problems. One is capacity. You might not have enough people to do the migration. But in this case, shouldn't be a problem because, as I mentioned before, you can have Groovy and Kotlin DSL files living together, so you can migrate gradually. But what about stability? Stability is also an issue. If you have a big project, you don't want to block any release while you refactor things. And if you take smaller steps and you migrate a script one at a time, it shouldn't be a problem either. You could easily migrate it. And how difficult it is to maintain. As I said, if you're using Kotlin already, it shouldn't be more effort than maintaining your Kotlin files. Oh, I forgot to mention something. 2 days ago, when I was discussing with a colleague about the 3 key things which makes a difference between the syntax in Groovy and Kotlin, he mentioned that there is already a converter. So you don't even need to worry about how to migrate your scripts. It's called Gradle Kotlin Converter. I haven't tried because I was adding it to the slides yesterday, but it's worth to give a try. If you have many, many Gradle files, it might be very useful. So as you can see, there are many, many benefits of using Kotlin DSL in your Gradle scripts. You can have a better experience with Android Studio, and also you can be more productive and understand better what your colleagues and what other people have created with their plugins. So I would say that it's really nice to try, and I hope in the near future you give it a try. Thank you very much. I hope you have a nice time. Any questions? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not sure what it's called, but you know, when you build Gradle, if you've got a dependency that's got like a out-of-date version, Android Studio like flag it and say, you know, you can right-click it and update the version manually. Does that work in the new system that you showed us with the arrays and stuff like that?
Yes.
Or it does.
So you mean when I was showing version code in the Groovy DSL script and in the Kotlin DSL script? Yes.
Yeah.
If you click on it, it will move you to the declaration of the version code, and you can see the documentation from the Gradle plugin.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi. You said the build take time. So will it happen on Bitrise or Jenkins server, like where we are building our APKs?
Can you say again, please?
So you said like the Gradle build take time. It's 3 times slower to the Groovy build. So
yes.
will it take more time on Bitrise as well?
Yes, it will take more time in Jenkins as well. Yeah. No more questions? Cool. Thank you very much.